Hermann Göring stood before Adolf Hitler in July 1940, with the confidence of a man who'd never lost. His Luftwaffe had smashed Poland in weeks, swept through France like a summer storm, and sent the British Expeditionary Force scrambling across the beaches at Dunkirk. Now, with Britain isolated and seemingly helpless, Göring made a promise that would define the summer. Give him 3 weeks of good weather, and the Royal Air Force would cease to exist. 3 weeks. Days to obliterate an entire air force, clear the skies over southern England, and pave the way for Operation Sea Lion, the amphibious invasion that would force Churchill to his knees. Hitler listened, and he believed. Why wouldn't he? The Reichsmarshal commanded the largest air force on Earth. Nearly 2,800 aircraft spread across occupied France, Belgium, Holland, and Norway. His bomber fleet had terrorized Rotterdam and Warsaw into submission. His fighter pilots were combat-hardened veterans with Spanish Civil War experience and the recent French campaign under their belts. Against this juggernaut stood RAF Fighter Command. Roughly 650 operational fighters, many flown by boys barely out of training, scattered across makeshift airfields in Kent, Sussex, and Essex. The mathematics seemed brutal and simple. Göring's Mess's Bf-109s could escort waves of Heinkel and Dornier bombers straight into the heart of England. Flatten the RAF's airfields, destroy their aircraft on the ground, and starve Britain of the one thing standing between Hitler and total European domination: air superiority. The 3-week timeline wasn't arbitrary. German naval commanders had made it clear they needed absolute control of the skies before risking an invasion fleet across the Channel. The Kriegsmarine had watched the Royal Navy's firepower at Mao. Dunkirk and harbored no illusions about what British destroyers would do to slow-moving barges packed with infantry. But if the Luftwaffe could sweep the RAF aside, if Göring's bombers could pummel Portsmouth and do into rubble, whilst his fighters massacred any British aircraft foolish enough to rise and challenge them, then perhaps, just perhaps, the Channel could become a German lake for the few hours needed to land the first wave of troops on English soil. Göring's confidence rested on more than numbers. German intelligence, the Abwehr and Luftwaffe reconnaissance units, had spent June and early July photographing RAF installations, counting aircraft, tracking squadron movements. Their reports painted a picture of an exhausted force. Fighter Command had lost over 450 aircraft during the fall of France and the Dunkirk evacuation. Pilot losses had been grievous. Nearly 300 killed, wounded, or captured. British industry was scrambling to replace Hurricanes and Spitfires. But factories couldn't conjure experienced pilots from thin air. Training schools were cutting courses from 6 months to 4 weeks, churning out youngsters who could barely navigate in cloud, let alone dogfight against Luftwaffe aces with 30 kills to their names. From his headquarters at Kranhal, north of Berlin, Göring issued Directive No. 17 on 1 August 1940. The objective was clinical: destroy the RAF as a fighting force within 4 days of the operation's launch, then spend the remaining time mopping up airfields and aircraft factories, 4 days of concentrated fury, then 2.5 weeks of consolidation. By late August, the Luftwaffe would own the skies and the invasion barges would motor across a channel as safe as the Rhine. Subordinate commanders Hugo Sperler, Albert Kessler, Hans-Jürgen Stumpf received their orders and began marshalling their Luftflotten across the occupied territories. Air crews painted fresh kill markings on their fuselages. Ground crews loaded bombs and ammunition, and meteorologists studied weather patterns over the Channel, waiting for the clear skies Göring needed. What none of them fully grasped was that RAF Fighter Command wasn't organized like the air forces they'd already crushed. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding had spent 4 years building something new: an integrated air defense system that married radar stations along the coast with observer corps inland, all feeding information to sector stations that could scramble fighters within minutes of a threat appearing. Dowding's system was Britain's secret, not a weapon, but a method. It meant the RAF didn't need to mount standing patrols that exhausted pilots and wasted fuel. It meant British fighters could be precisely where German bombers weren't expecting them. And it meant Göring's 3-week promise was about to collide with a defense that could bend without breaking, bleed without dying, and turn arithmetic into attrition. Adler Eagle Day was scheduled for 10th of August 1940, then postponed to the 13th when weather turned foul over the Channel. When the morning finally arrived, it brought chaos instead of triumph. Goring's grand offensive meant to shatter fighter command in a single overwhelming blow stumbled from the first minute. At 5:30 that morning, reconnaissance aircraft reported cloud banks thickening over southern England. Kesselring, commanding Luftwaffe 2, hesitated, then issued a postponement order. The radio signal went out, but half his bomber groups never received it. Some formations turned back mid-channel, creating confusion amongst the fighter escorts. Others pressed on, believing the mission was still active. Dornier D-17 bombers droned towards the Kent coast without proper fighter cover, only to find RAF Spitfires diving out of the cloud layer near Canterbury. The day's first engagement became a running massacre as British fighters harried the bombers all the way back to France. The afternoon missions fared little better. Luftwaffe planners had identified Rafi's Church, Detling, and Rochester as critical fighter stations that needed immediate destruction. Intelligence officers had marked them on maps. Bomber crews had studied reconnaissance photographs, and at 15:30 hours a massive formation crossed the coast near Dover, with these targets locked in. The problem, one that would plague German planning throughout the coming months, was that East Church and Detling weren't fighter command stations at all. They belonged to Coastal Command, housing reconnaissance aircraft and maritime patrol units. Rochester was a training air drone. The Luftwaffe expended hundreds of tons of high explosive and incendiary bombs, cratering runways and destroying hangars that had almost nothing to do with the defensive fighter force they were supposed to annihilate. Meanwhile, actual fighter command bases, Biggin Hill, Kenley, Hornchurch, watched the smoke rising from their neighbors and kept their Hurricanes and Spitfires ready for the next wave. This fundamental intelligence failure revealed something Goring hadn't anticipated. Britain's air defense wasn't concentrated in neat, obvious clusters. Fighter command's airfields were dispersed across southern England in a web of sector stations, satellite fields, and forward operating bases. Some were grass strips barely visible from the air. Others were camouflaged so effectively that German reconnaissance photographs showed farmland, where Spitfires actually sat beneath netting and painted canvas. The Luftwaffe's maps compiled from pre-war sources and drushed. Photographic sorties were riddled with errors. Airfields marked as active had been abandoned. Bomber stations were misidentified as fighter bases. Decoy airfields complete with wooden aircraft and oil fire smoke generators drew attacks whilst real squadrons operated from fields 5 miles away. The day's tally told the story. The Luftwaffe flew 1,485 sorties, the largest single day's effort yet, and lost 45 aircraft. Fighter Command flew 700 sorties and lost 13 fighters with 7 pilots killed. But beyond the numbers lay a more troubling reality for German planners. RAF squadrons were still operational, still scrambling, still fighting. Göring had promised devastation. He delivered inconvenience. That evening, as bomber crews returned to their bases in occupied France and Belgium, ground crews counted the bullet holes, patched the shredded aluminium, and wondered why the British fighters kept appearing exactly where they weren't supposed to be. Some air crews reported radar towers along the English coast, tall steel masts that German intelligence had noted but never properly understood. A few veteran pilots muttered that the British seemed to know they were coming before they'd even crossed the channel. They were right. Britain's chain-home radar network, stretching from Land's End to the Shetlands, was tracking every major formation from the moment it assembled over France. The stations weren't sophisticated by later standards. They couldn't detect aircraft below 500 FT, couldn't always distinguish friend from foe, and frequently gave bearing estimates that were miles off. But they gave Fighter Command something priceless: time. 20 minutes warning meant squadrons could be at 15,000 FT when German bombers arrived. Rather than caught climbing slowly from their airfields, it meant controllers at sector stations could vector fighters to intercept points, concentrating force against specific raids rather than scattering patrols uselessly across empty sky. Dowding's system was working exactly as designed, turning Göring's numerical advantage into a series of smaller, manageable engagements where British pilots could fight, disengage, land, refuel, and fight again. The 14th and 15th brought more of the same: massive German formations, frantic dogfights, and RAF squadrons that refused to die. Göring grew impatient. He'd promised 3 weeks, and Eagle Day alone was supposed to break the back of British resistance. Instead, his intelligence officers were reporting that Fighter Command remained operational across the southeast. Worse, Luftwaffe losses were climbing, not catastrophically, nothing like the disaster that would eventually unfold, but steadily, relentlessly, like blood leaking from a wound that wouldn't clot. Hugh Dowding commanded a force that existed in a state of permanent mathematical crisis. On paper, Fighter Command could muster roughly 650 operational fighters on any given day in early August. About 350 Hurricanes and 300 Spitfires, scattered across 52 squadrons from Scotland to Cornwall. Against this stood the Luftwaffe's 2,600 aircraft, 120 bombers, 280 Stuka dive bombers, 790 single-engine Bf-109 fighters, and 260 twin-engine Bf-110 fighters. The disparity looked insurmountable. German planners calculated they could launch 1,500 sorties a day, whilst Fighter Command struggled to put 600 aircraft into there, and many of those would be training units or squadrons stationed too far north to matter. But Dowding wasn't trying to match German numbers sortie for sortie. He was playing an entirely different game, one where survival counted as victory and time itself was a weapon. The system he'd built turned southern England into a lethal circuit. Chain home radar stations stood along the coast like sentinels, their steel towers rising 350 ft above the chalk cliffs of Dover and the shingle beaches of Suffolk. When German formations assembled over Killala or Cherbourg, radar operators would detect the characteristic blips on their cathode tubes, sometimes 50 minutes out to sea, giving controllers nearly 20 minutes before the enemy crossed the English coastline. These raw detections fed into Fighter Command's filter room at Bentley Priory, where WAFs, Women's Auxiliary Air Force plotters, converted electronic signals into wooden blocks on giant map tables, each block representing an enemy raid with estimated strength, altitude, and heading. Group controllers watched these blocks creep across the channel, then issued orders to sector stations. This is where Dowding's genius became operational reality. Sector stations, places like Biggin Hill, Kenley, Hornurk, Tangmere, and Middle Wallop, commanded clusters of airfields within a 30-mile radius. Each sector controller sat in an operations room, watching his own map table, receiving updates every 30 seconds from Bentley Priory. When a raid threatened his area, he'd scramble squadrons with precise instructions. Climb to 20,000 ft Vector 100 tender intercept estimated 15 miles south of base. Pilots would lift off from grass strips, still wet with morning dew, claw for altitude, and find themselves positioned perfectly to dive onto German bomber formations from above and behind. The bounce that gave them every advantage surprise could offer. The speed of this system shocked German air crews. Luftwaffe air intelligence had assumed British fighters would need standing patrols, aircraft constantly circling above likely targets, burning fuel, exhausting pilots. Instead, RAF squadrons remained on the ground until the last possible moment. Pilots lounged in dispersal huts playing cards, reading newspapers, some sleeping in deck chairs beneath the wings of their Hurricanes. Then the telephone would ring, the operations officer would shout, "Scramble," and within 4 minutes, sometimes 3, 12 fighters would be airborne and climbing. By the time German bombers reached the English coast, Spitfires were already above them, throttles wide open, gun sights glowing amber. Fighter Command organized itself into 3 groups defending different regions. Number 11 Group, commanded by Keith Park, held the critical southeast sector, Kent, Sussex, Essex, where the Luftwaffe focused 80% of its attacks. Park had 23 squadrons, but he rarely committed more than 2 or 3 to any single raid, preserving his strength whilst inflicting maximum disruption on German formations. Number 10 Group under Quinton Brand covered the southwest and could reinforce Park when needed. Number 12 Group, led by Trafford Lee-Mallory, defended the Midlands and East Anglia. This layered defense meant that even if the Luftwaffe smashed through Park squadrons, fresh fighters waited beyond. German bomber crews who thought they'd fought their way clear of British defenses would find themselves under attack again over London, then harried all the way back to the Channel B squadrons they hadn't known existed. The logistics were brutal and relentless. Hurricanes and Spitfires typically carried fuel for 90 minutes off-flight, less if pilots used emergency boost or fought at high throttle settings. This meant rapid turnarounds. Ground crews developed astonishing efficiency. A Hurricane could land, tuxedo dispersal, be refueled, rearmed with 2,660 rounds of 303 ammunition across 8 Browning machine guns, and be ready for flight again within 15 minutes. Pilots would grab a cup of tea, scribble a combat report, and climb back into cockpit still warm from the previous sortie. On peak days, Some squadrons flew 5 missions between dawn and dusk. Pilots who'd been undergraduate students 6 months earlier were now combat veterans, logging 30 hours of operational flying per week. Dowding rationed his force with surgical precision. He kept squadrons rotating through 11 groups' frontline stations, giving exhausted units time to rest and train replacements in quieter sectors up north. This rotation prevented total collapse. German pilots flew until they were shot down, captured, or suffered nervous exhaustion. British pilots flew until they were rotated out, giving fighter command a sustainable operational tempo that the Luftwaffe, for all its numerical superiority, couldn't break. The 15th of August 1940 became known in Luftwaffe records as Black Thursday, though the name wouldn't stick in popular memory the way later dates would. Göring threw everything at Britain that day. A coordinated assault from 3 directions meant to overwhelm fighter command through sheer scale and confusion. Luftwaffe 5, stationed in Norway and Denmark under Hans Jürgen Stumpf, would strike northeast England, whilst Kesselring and Spur's forces hammered the southeast. The theory was elegant: forced the British to split their defenses, spread their squadrons thin, create gaps that bomber formations could exploit. The reality became the Luftwaffe's bloodiest day of the battle so far, and it exposed assumptions that German planning had treated as gospel. Stumpf's northern raid launched first. 65 Hankelheer 111 bombers and 34 Messerschmitt Bf 110. Long-range fighters crossed the North Sea shortly after midday, aimed at airfields in Yorkshire and Newcastle. German intelligence had assured Stumpf that fighter command kept minimal forces in the north, perhaps 2 or 3 squadrons at most, barely enough to mount token resistance. The bombers wouldn't even need single-engine fighter escort. The Bf-110s, with their twin engines and heavy armament, could handle whatever opposition appeared. This calculation disintegrated 40 off the Northumberland coast when chain-home radar at Danby Beacon detected the incoming raid. 7 squadrons scrambled from airfields across northern England, 72 Hurricanes and Spitfires rising to meet an enemy that had expected almost none. The slaughter began over the Farne Islands. British fighters tore into the German formations from multiple angles, and the Bf-110s, vaunted as bomber destroyers, proved hopelessly outmatched against nimble single-engine fighters. The 110's straight-line speed was decent, but it turned like a lorry, and its rear gunner's single machine gun couldn't cover the blind spots that Spitfire pilots exploited ruthlessly. Within 20 minutes, 8 Bf-110s were spinning into the North Sea, trailing smoke and flames. The Hankel bombers jettisoned their loads over empty countryside and fled eastward, pursued by British fighters all the way to the 12-mile limit. Stumpf's gamble cost him 20 aircraft, nearly a quarter of his attacking force, and achieved precisely nothing. He never attempted a daylight raid on northern England again. The southern attacks fared marginally better, but bled just as heavily. Wave after wave crossed the channel throughout the afternoon. 20 bombers escorted by 150 fighters at 13 hours. Another 90 bombers with 130 fighters at 15:30. Then a third strike of 100 bombers at 17:45 Parks. 11 group controllers worked themselves to exhaustion, scrambling squadron after squadron, stacking British fighters at different altitudes to hit German formations in relay. The Luftwaffe reached some targets. Martlesham Heath Airfield took a pounding. Hawking suffered runway damage, but the cost was staggering. Every raid that penetrated inland lost bombers to British fighters on the way in, then lost more during the bombing run, then bled aircraft all the way back across Kent as fresh RAF squadrons joined the pursuit. German air crews discovered that British pilots fought with a savagery born of defending their own soil. Luftwaffe doctrine emphasized formation integrity, bombers staying tight, fighters maintaining escort position. RAF pilots had no such constraints. They'd dive from 25,000 FT, smash through fighter screens, rake a bomber with 8 gun bursts, then vanish back into cloud before the escorts could react. Hurricanes specialized in bomber killing. Their rugged construction and stable gun platforms perfect for the deflection shooting needed to hit a Dornier's engines or fuel tanks. Spitfires hunted the Bf-109s, turning the escort fighters into a separate battle that pulled them away from the bombers they were supposed to protect. This forced German formations into an impossible choice: maintain tight formation and accept that fighters couldn't pursue attackers or break formation to chase British aircraft and leave the bombers exposed. By sunset on the 15th, the Luftwaffe had lost 75 aircraft, bombers, fighters, dive bombers, reconnaissance planes, Fighter Command lost 34 fighters, but critically only 17 pilots died. The rest bailed out over friendly territory were back in combat within days, some event that same evening after hitching lorry rides back to their airfields. This asymmetry would define the battle. When a Bf-109 went down over England, its pilot became a prisoner of war, gone permanently from the Luftwaffe's order of battle. When a Hurricane crashed in Kent, there was a decent chance the pilot would walk away with burns or bruises, spend a week in hospital, and return to his squadron. Germany was losing experienced aircrew faster than training schools could replace them. Each loss was permanent. Each British loss was potentially recoverable. Yet Fighter Command was hemorrhaging pilots in absolute terms. Dowding needed 2,500 qualified fighter pilots to maintain operational strength. He had perhaps lost 200 by mid-August, and that number dropped daily. Training schools were producing 200 new pilots per month, but the battle was killing, wounding or exhausting 120 per week. The mathematics were brutal and unsustainable. Squadrons that should have fielded 26 pilots were operating with 16. Some pilots were flying 4 or 5 sorties daily, accumulating fatigue that slowed reflexes and dulled judgment. The difference between spotting and attacking Bf-109 and dying without ever seeing what killed you. Dowding was winning the daily battles and but slowly losing the war of attrition, and Göring's 3-week deadline, though already missed, didn't matter if Fighter Command simply collapsed from exhaustion before September arrived. The Luftwaffe's campaign entered its most dangerous phase in late August. Göring, frustrated by Fighter Command's refusal to die on schedule, issued new directives on the 24th. Ignore everything except RAF fighter airfields and aircraft factories. No more wasted bombs on coastal targets. No more diversions against harbors or radar stations. The focus would be surgical and relentless. Destroy the airfields from which British fighters operated. Crater their runways, flatten their hangars, kill their ground crews, and leave Fighter Command with nowhere to land, rearm, or repair. For 12 days this strategy nearly worked. Between 24th of August and 6th of September, German bombers hammered the sector stations that formed the nervous system of Dowding's defense network. Biggin Hill took the worst of it. On 30th of August, a formation of Junkers Do-88 bombers appeared over the airfield at lunchtime, precisely when most personnel were queuing for meals. The bombs walked across the station in neat lines. Hangars erupted. Barracks collapsed. The operations block took a direct hit that killed the senior WAF officer and 11 plotters. The telephone lines connecting Biggin Hill to Bentley Priory were severed, cutting the sector station off from higher command. 39 personnel died in that single raid. The next day the Germans came back, and the day after that. By 6th of September, Big Hill had been attacked 6 times in 8 days. Craters pocked the grass airfield like lunar landscape. Unexploded bombs forced engineers to close sections of the field, and the operations room had been moved into a commandeered shop in the nearby village because the original facility was uninhabitable rubble. Kenley, Horner, Northweald, Debden all suffered similar punishment. Ground crews learned to work through raids, refueling Hurricanes whilst bombs exploded 200 yards away, patching bullet holes in wings as Earth geysered skyward from fresh impacts. Some airfields became so cratered that only half the normal number of aircraft could operate safely. Engineers worked through the nights filling holes with rubble and compacted earth, racing to have runways operational by dawn, when the next German raid would inevitably arrive. Sector controllers moved their operations rooms into requisitioned houses, pubs, even cricket pavilions, anywhere with telephone lines and space for a map table. The improvisation kept the system functioning, but barely. Park was rotating exhausted squadrons out of 11 group every few days, replacing them with fresh units from quieter sectors. But the replacement squadrons were increasingly composed of pilots with minimal combat experience, boys who'd logged perhaps 10 hours on Spitfires, thrust into dogfights against Luftwaffe veterans. The attrition was reaching critical mass. Between 24th August and 6th of September, Fighter Command lost 295 fighters, not all in combat, some tow accidents, mechanical failures, landing mishaps by exhausted pilots. British factories were producing roughly 470 fighters per month, so aircraft numbers remained stable, but pilot losses were catastrophic. 103 killed and 128 seriously wounded in those 2 weeks alone. That meant Fighter Command was bleeding nearly 20 pilots per day, over 500 per month, whilst training schools produced perhaps 250. The deficit was compounding daily. Squadrons that had started the battle with experienced flight commanders and section leaders were now led by pilots who'd been sergeants 3 weeks earlier. Promoted out of sheer necessity because everyone senior to them was dead or in hospital with burns, Dowding confronted a crisis that threatened to snap his entire defensive system. If the Luftwaffe maintained this tempo for another fortnight, several sector stations would become operationally useless. If that happened, gaps would open in the defensive coverage. German bombers could strike targets in the Midlands or London without facing organized interception. The integrated defense network, radar, sector control, scrambled interceptions would fragment into isolated squadrons fighting blindly without coordination, without the force multiplication that had kept fighter command viable despite being outnumbered 4-1. Some historians would later argue that Britain stood closer to defeat in the first week of September than at any other point in the war. Not defeat meaning invasion, but defeat meaning the loss of daylight air superiority, the ability to prevent German bombers from operating freely over southern England. Then Göring made the decision that saved fighter command. On the evening of 7th of September, German bombers appeared over London in force, 300 aircraft dropping incendiaries and high explosive across the East End docks. The Luftwaffe had bombed London before, usually by accident when crews missed their intended targets or jettisoned loads whilst fleeing British fighters. But this was deliberate, a strategic shift from attacking airfields to attacking the capital itself. Hitler had authorized the change partly in retaliation for RAF Bomber Command's recent raids on Berlin, partly because Göring believed that attacking London would force Fighter Command to commit every available squadron in defense of the city, allowing German fighters to destroy them in a single climactic battle. The reasoning was superficially logical, but strategically catastrophic. Every bomber load dropped on London was a bomber load not dropped on Kenley or Biggin Hill. Every hour the Luftwaffe spent over the Tempa maze was an hour Park's battered sector stations had torpedo runways, patch operations rooms, rest exhausted ground crews, and integrate replacement pilots. The pressure that had been slowly strangling Fighter Command simply lifted. Engineers at Hornchurch filled craters without being bombed mid-shift. Telephone linesmen at Northweald repaired trunk cables in peace. Sector controllers caught 4 hours of sleep instead of catnapping in their operations rooms between raids. Park quietly rotated his most damaged squadrons to Scotland for a fortnight's rest, replacing them with units that, whilst inexperienced, at least had pilots who weren't flying on adrenaline and tea after 3 weeks of continuous combat. Fighter Command, which had been perhaps 72 hours from systemic failure, was granted an 11-day reprieve it desperately needed and hadn't expected. Every Spitfire that burned on a Kentish hillside represented $9,500 of British taxpayer money, roughly the price of 6 semi-detached houses in suburban London. Every Hurricane cost $7,200. Supermarine and Hawker factories were churning out replacements at remarkable speed. By September 1940, British industry was producing 470 fighters monthly, outpacing Luftwaffe attrition and slowly rebuilding the reserve stockpiles that had been depleted during the French campaign. Lord Beaverbrook's Ministry of Aircraft Production had performed near miracles, stripping red tape from procurement, requisitioning metal from railings and pots, establishing repair units that could return damaged aircraft to service in days rather than weeks. The civilian repair organization salvaged wrecks from crash sites, rebuilt them in shadow factories scattered across the Midlands, and delivered refurbished fighters back to squadrons faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy them. Britain could replace machines. Replacing the men who flew them was the insoluble problem. Training a fighter pilot required 9 months under peacetime standards. Ground school covering navigation, meteorology, aircraft recognition, wireless procedure, then 50 hours on basic trainers like the Tiger Moth, advancing to 75 hours on more powerful aircraft, finally specializing on Hurricanes or Spitfires with another 40 hours learning formation flying, aerobatics, gunnery, and combat tactics. But Fighter Command didn't have 9 months. By August 1940, training had been compressed to 6 weeks for some courses. Pilots arrived at operational squadrons with perhaps 15 hours on Spitfires, no combat experience, minimal gunnery training, and a life expectancy measured in days. Squadron commanders called them, quote, sprogs, children essentially, and watched them die with sickening regularity, usually shot down during their first or second combat sortie by experienced German pilots who could spot inexperience in how a fighter turned, how it positioned itself, how it reacted when bounced from above. The Luftwaffe faced the opposite problem. German aircraft production lagged behind British output, roughly 220 Bf-109s per month against Britain's 470 Hurricanes and Spitfires combined. Messerschmitt factories were optimized for quality over quantity, each 109 requiring extensive hand-fitting and skilled labor. Germany had no equivalent to Britain's repair organization. Damaged aircraft were often written off rather than salvaged. But the critical shortage wasn't airframes. It was experienced pilots, and Germany was hemorrhaging them over southern England at a rate that couldn't be sustained. Every Bf-109 pilot shot down over Kent was gone permanently, killed, captured, or drowned in the Channel, unlike British pilots who could bail out over friendly territory and returned to combat within hours. German aircrew who survived their aircraft's destruction faced prison camp or death. The mathematics grew uglier for the Luftwaffe with each passing week. In July, Germany had roughly 900 fully trained single-engine fighter pilots. By early September, combat losses had reduced that number to approximately 35, whilst Fighter Command, despite taking horrific casualties, maintained around 1,000 pilots through its brutal but functional rotation system and compressed training pipeline. Luftwaffe training schools couldn't accelerate production without compromising quality, and German doctrine demanded far more extensive training than British equivalents. A Bf-109 pilot typically logged 240 hours before reaching an operational squadron. Superb preparation, but it meant replacement pilots took 10 months to produce. The battle was burning through aircrew faster than the pipeline could replenish them. German fighter units were particularly brittle. Jagdschwader Squadron started the battle with an establishment strength of 40 aircraft and pilots. By mid-September, most were operating at 50 to 60% strength. Barely 20 serviceable aircraft flown by pilots increasingly composed of either exhausted veterans or under-trained replacements. The veterans were suffering cumulative fatigue, flying 3 or 4 sorties daily, crossing the Channel, knowing that mechanical failure or combat damage meant ditching in hostile waters with perhaps 10 minutes before hypothermia or drowning claimed them. The psychological toll was immense. Luftwaffe pilots began calling the sky over southern England, the canal, the sewer, a place where comrades vanished daily, and the British fighters never seemed to diminish, no matter how many were claimed as destroyed. Goring's intelligence services compounded the problem by feeding him wildly optimistic assessments. German pilots, like all fighter pilots, habitually overclaimed kills in the chaos of combat. When 3 Bf-109s fired at the same Hurricane and it went down, all 3 pilots might claim a victory. Luftwaffe intelligence recorded all 3 claims, compiled them, and reported to Goring that Fighter Command had lost 3 aircraft. Multiply this across hundreds of engagements, and German records by early September showed that the RAF should have been annihilated twice over. Intelligence estimates suggested Fighter Command had perhaps 100 fighters remaining. The actual number was closer to 650. This phantom victory led Goring to make increasingly reckless commitments, throwing formations into England, expecting minimal resistance only to find British squadrons rising to meet them in undiminished strength. The economic arithmetic was equally grim for Germany. Each Bf-109 cost 50,000 Reichsmarks, roughly $4,500 at 1940 exchange rates. A Henkel, a 111 bomber, cost to 40,000 Reichsmarks. Every raid over England was burning through millions in lost aircraft, spare parts, aviation fuel, and munitions. Germany had conquered most of Europe and looted its resources. But the Reich's economy wasn't mobilized for total war yet. Factories still operated on single shifts. Women weren't employed in heavy industry. Consumer goods production continued. Britain, by contrast, had converted to war footing completely. Every available factory repurposed, rationing biting hard. The entire island transformed into a fortress workshop dedicated solely to survival. The financial sustainability of the air campaign favored the defender, and Germany was discovering that air superiority couldn't be purchased with a 3-week spending spree. It required sustained investment over months, perhaps years, and the longer the battle dragged on, the more the economic and industrial balance tilted towards Britain. Sunday, 15th of September 1940, dawn clear and bright across southern England, perfect flying weather, the kind of high-pressure system that promised visibility stretching to the horizon. German meteorologists had been waiting for conditions like this, and Göring seized the opportunity to launch what he intended as the knockout blow. 2 massive raids would strike London in succession, overwhelming Fighter Command through sheer weight of numbers. The morning wave assembled over northern France shortly after 11. Approximately 200 bombers escorted by 400 fighters, a formation so large that radar operators at Dover initially thought their equipment was malfunctioning. No raid had ever approached this scale. Park's controllers watched the plots develop on their map tables and realized immediately that this wasn't a feint or a diversionary attack. This was everything the Luftwaffe had, thrown at London in a single coordinated hammer blow meant to finish the battle. Park scrambled 11 squadrons, every available fighter in 11 group. Lee Mullally 12 group contributed 5 squadrons flying in the big wing formation he'd been advocating for weeks. 60 fighters assembling over North London before diving south to intercept. For once, the timing worked perfectly. The German formations crossed the coast near Dover at 11:30 and immediately ran into waves of British fighters, stacked at different altitudes from 15,000 to 25,000. Hurricanes tore into the bomber formations while Spitfires engaged the Bf-109 escorts, forcing them into turning battles that burned fuel and pulled them away from their charges. The Hankels and Dornier pressed on, holding tight formation, their gunners sending tracer streams across the sky. But the relentless attacks fragmented the neat boxes of bombers. Some crews jettisoned their loads over Kent farmland and turned for home. Others pressed towards London only to find fresh British squadrons rising from Hornchurch and north to meet them. The bombs that reached London fell across a wide arc. Some hit the docks. Others scattered across residential neighborhoods in Lambeth and Camberwell. The damage was real but diffuse. Nothing like the concentrated devastation Goring had envisioned. More critically, the Luftwaffe was bleeding aircraft throughout the entire raid. Bombers limped back across Kent trailing smoke, one engine dead. Gunners frantically firing at pursuing Hurricanes. Fighters nursing damaged engines or wounded pilots made emergency landings on French beaches or ditched in the channel within sight of the English coast. By the time the last German aircraft recrossed the Dover coastline shortly after 13, Luftwaffe formations had been in action for 2 hours, and Fighter Command was still operational, still vectoring fresh squadrons into intercept positions. The afternoon raid launched at 14 before the morning survivors had even been properly debriefed. Another 150 bombers, another 300 fighters crossing the coast near Dungeness with London as their target. German air crews were exhausted, having flown a morning mission, landed, refueled, rearmed, and launched again with barely an hour's rest. Some pilots were flying their third sortie of the day. Fighter Command, by contrast, had rotated squadrons during the midday lull. The morning's combat units were on the ground refueling whilst fresh squadrons scrambled to meet the afternoon attack. Park had learned the rhythm of German operations over 3 months of combat. He knew the Luftwaffe typically launched raids in waves separated by 2 to 3 hours, giving him precious windows to rotate tired pilots out and bring rested ones in. The afternoon battle followed the morning's pattern, but with even heavier losses for the Germans. British pilots, worried by the morning's success and flying aircraft with full fuel tanks, pressed attacks with renewed aggression. The Duxford Wing, Lee Mullally's masked formation, caught a group of Dornier bombers over South London with minimal fighter escort and carved through them methodically. 5 Dorns went down over Surrey in less than 10 minutes, crews bailing out of land in suburban gardens where housewives offered them tea, before the police arrived to take them prisoner. German fighter pilots nursing near empty fuel tanks after the long escort mission were forced to break off and run for France, leaving bombers to fend for themselves during the most dangerous part of the mission, the withdrawal when British fighters could attack from behind without worrying about being bounced themselves. By 1:70, the second raid was over. Both sides retired to count their aircraft and compile combat reports. Initial British claims were wildly optimistic. Park squadrons reported 185 German aircraft destroyed. The actual figure was 60, but even that represented a catastrophic loss rate for the Luftwaffe. 60 aircraft meant roughly 180 aircrew killed, captured, or missing. It meant 60 holes in the operational order of battle that couldn't be filled quickly. Fighter Command lost 26 fighters with 13 pilots killed, painful but sustainable within Dowding's rotation system. The ratio was devastating. For every British fighter lost, the Luftwaffe lost more than 2 aircraft, many of them bombers carrying 4 or 5 crew each. Hitler met with his military commanders the following day. The reports from the 15th made grim reading. Goring had promised that Fighter Command was down to its last few dozen aircraft. Yet German formations had faced hundreds of British fighters over London. Either the intelligence was catastrophically wrong, or the British were somehow producing fighters faster than Germany could destroy them. Neither possibility suggested the quick victory Hitler needed. The Kriegsmarine had already postponed Sea Lion once, citing weather and inadequate air cover. Now, with autumn storms approaching and fighter command demonstrably still operational, Hitler issued a new directive on 17th of September. Operation Sea Lion was postponed indefinitely. The invasion fleet assembled at great cost in channel ports would disperse. Germany would not attempt an amphibious assault on Britain in 1940, possibly not ever. The air battle would continue, but its strategic purpose, clearing the way for invasion, had just evaporated. Göring's 3-week promise, made with such confidence in July, had stretched to 10 weeks and ended in failure. The battle didn't end on 15th of September, though that date would later be commemorated as Battle of Britain Day, the moment when invasion became impossible and British survival inevitable. The Luftwaffe continued daylight operations throughout late September. But the character of the campaign had fundamentally changed. Göring's bombers now crossed the Channel at altitudes above 20,000 ft, sometimes above 25,000 ft, where the thin air reduced bomb accuracy to near worthlessness, but offered some protection from British fighters. Formations grew smaller and more cautious. The massive waves of 200 bombers escorted by 400 fighters gave way to raids of 30 or 40 aircraft, darting across Kent to drop bombs vaguely in London's direction before fleeing back to France. These weren't the actions of an air force on the verge of victory. These were the tactics of an attacker who'd realized the cost of persistence exceeded any possible gain. By early October, daylight raids had become sporadic and ineffectual. The Luftwaffe lost 325 aircraft in September alone. Bombers, fighters, reconnaissance planes, and their placements arriving from Germany were increasingly flown by pilots with minimal operational experience. Jagdgeschwader units that had started the battle with veteran Spanish Civil War pilots were now padded out with youngsters who'd logged perhaps 80 hours on Bf-109s, barely enough to handle the aircraft competently, utterly insufficient for the split-second life-or-death decisions that defined combat over southern England. These replacement pilots died quickly, shot down by RAF pilots who'd survived 3 months of daily combat and learned every trick of the trade. The Luftwaffe's qualitative edge, which had seemed so decisive in July, had been ground away through attrition, replaced by a force that was numerically impressive but increasingly hollow in terms of combat effectiveness. Göring, faced with unsustainable losses and a strategic objective he could no longer achieve, pivoted to night bombing. The Blitz, the sustained nighttime bombing campaign against British cities, began in earnest in October 1940 and would continue until May 1941. London, Coventry, Birmingham, Liverpool, Glasgow, and dozens of smaller cities endured nightly raids that killed over 43,000 civilians and destroyed vast swathes of urban housing. The night campaign was devastating for British morale and murderous for civilians, but it represented strategic admission of failure. Night bombing couldn't achieve air superiority. It couldn't suppress fighter command. It couldn't prevent British factories from producing fighters or British training schools from graduating pilots. It was terror for terror's sake. Punishment because conquest had proven impossible, and whilst it inflicted genuine suffering, it didn't advance Germany's strategic position by a single inch. Fighter command's losses throughout the battle had been severe but survivable. Between 10th of July and 31st October, the official dates the Air Ministry later assigned to the Battle of Britain. Fighter command lost 1.23 aircraft destroyed and 537 pilots killed. Another 1547 fighters were damaged but repayable. These were grievous numbers, but British industry and training infrastructure had kept pace. By November, fighter command was stronger than it had been in July, with more squadrons, more aircraft, and a cadre of combat-experienced pilots who'd survived the crucible and emerged as deadly efficient killers. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, had lost approximately 1,887 aircraft, bombers, fighters, dive bombers, reconnaissance planes, and over 2,500 aircrew killed or captured. Those losses were irreplaceable in any meaningful time frame. Germany's training infrastructure couldn't produce experienced bomber crews or fighter pilots at the rate the battle had consumed them. The strategic ramifications rippled outward through the rest of the war. Britain's survival meant Hitler faced a hostile nation on his western flank when he turned east to invade the Soviet Union in June 1941. It meant RAF bomber. Command could operate from British airfields, launching night raids against German industrial targets throughout 1941 and 1942. It meant the United States had an unsinkable aircraft carrier off the coast of Europe when America entered the war in December 1941, a staging base for the eventual invasion of France. Every subsequent Allied victory, North Africa, Sicily, Normandy, traced its roots back to Britain's ability to deny Germany air superiority in the summer of 1940. If Göring's 3-week promise had come true, if fighter command had collapsed in August, and invasion barges had motored across a defenseless channel, the entire trajectory of the Second World War would have bent towards Axis victory. The battle became mythologized almost immediately. Churchill's phrase about "never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few" entered the language within days of the September crisis. The 2936 aircrew who flew with fighter command during those months became national heroes, their youth and sacrifice embodying Britain's refusal to surrender. But the mythology sometimes obscured the unglamorous reality of why Britain won. It wasn't because British pilots were braver or more skilled than their German counterparts. Combat reports from both sides suggest rough par in individual ability. Britain won because Dowding built a system that could sustain losses, because radar and sector control multiplied the effectiveness of outnumbered squadrons, because British industry outproduced German factories, because the battle was fought over British territory, where downed pilots could return to duty, and because Göring made catastrophic strategic decisions at critical moments, particularly the shift to bombing London just when airfield attacks were succeeding. Göring's 3-week boast became a dark joke within the Luftwaffe itself. Junior officers would whisper sardonic comments about another 3 weeks, and we'll have them whenever fresh directives arrive from Carenhall. The Reich Marshal's reputation, once formidable, never recovered. He'd been given the largest air force on Earth, numerical superiority, combat-experienced crews, and explicit orders from Hitler to clear the skies for invasion. He'd failed comprehensively, visibly in a campaign that dragged 4 months instead of 3 weeks, and ended with Germany abandoning its invasion plans, whilst RAF fighters still ruled the daylight skies over southern England. History would record many German failures during the Second World War. Stalingrad, Kursk, the Ardennes. But the Battle of Britain was the first, the moment when the myth of Nazi invincibility shattered against British determination and Dowding's quietly brilliant defensive system. 3 weeks, 4 months. The difference between Göring's promise and reality measured the gap between German ambition and the stubborn, unglamorous arithmetic of air defense done properly.